New Zealand has a legacy of deadly disasters.
The whole party seemed to fall at once.
Praying to God because I wanted to survive.
Scary. Very scary.
Disasters that shaped this country.
Where I'm standing is where my grandfather got involved in the battle with the Turks.
2 yachts were lost forever.
The worst motoring accident in New Zealand history.
7 well-known New Zealanders retrace our darkest days, bringing history alive. Through the eyes of descendants.
It stayed with me. Probably always will.
It was something that we will never, ever forget, all of us.
On April the 25th, 1915, the first of more than 13,000 New Zealand soldiers landed here on the Turkish Gallipoli Peninsula in a place that would become known as Anzac Cove. Eventually, nearly 2,800 New Zealanders were killed at Gallipoli, and nearly twice that number again were injured. One of those wounded was my grandfather, Martin Brooke. Historians tell us Gallipoli was where New Zealand lost its innocence and found its identity. Now, 100 years later, I want to know more about Gallipoli, my grandfather's involvement, and why this ill-fated campaign has such a prominent place in New Zealand's history. How did young men like my grandfather end up here? And what lasting legacy has it left on the families of the men who fought here? As we commemorate its centenary, Gallipoli remains one of New Zealand's worst military disasters. I've played for New Zealand, but my grandfather nearly gave his life for this country. He volunteered for the Great War here in Pukekohe in the second week, August 1914. When he was 96, my grandfather was interviewed by oral historians Jane Tollerton and Nicholas Boyack. Our family have never heard that recording. It will be a new experience for us all. In the early 1900s, Pukekohe was a busy rural town. But when war was declared on August the 4th, 1914, the Empire called and New Zealand was quick to answer. Great Britain declares war on Germany. My grandfather is going to wake up and see these papers. That would be rather scary for him, but as my grandfather is English, he's going to have an obligation to sign up for it. And sign up he did. Martin Brooke was 22 and ready for adventure. Our brave boys, our brave boys. There he is, Martin Brooke. He's made the local paper. I'm embarrassed to say I know little about my grandfather's Gallipoli. Maybe my father, Sandy, will know more. Now, living in England, I've not seen my father for some years, so I've asked Sandy to meet me at the old Karaka farm, the place he grew up and where I spent my first year. Hey, Sandy.
Hi.
How are you?
Oh, can't complain.
Right? Yeah. Give me ugly.
You all right? Jeez, you got... Christ, you
Eh?
some beef on there.
What's it like being back here?
It's marvellous to come back to have a look. First time I've been back for 50-odd years.
As a returning soldier, Martin acquired this farm when he came home. And later on, he left Sandy in no doubt about Gallipoli.
It was absolute murder going into Gallipoli because he said they just got into a rock face, landed on the beach. The Turks up above just machine gunned them as soon as they came off the boat.
So he actually told you that?
Yeah, he said it was one hell of a place to be.
Martin was seriously injured in Gallipoli. he carried the scars for the rest of his life.
I remember as a kid when we used to go and visit him in Pukekohe, I used to go and touch his elbow, and it was like a big lemon, wasn't it? And it was so...
Oh, he used to give him hell in the winter.
Did it?
Yeah, he used to get Mum to rub it. So just ached like a toothache.
My grandfather had run away from England looking for adventure when he was 17. Arriving in Banks Peninsula, he worked on farms, gradually making his way north.
Have you not heard this before?
No.
I thought, oh, I'm going to join up. So I got on the train, came into Auckland. I went straight down to the hall. I said, look, I want to be in the Auckland Mounted Rifles. I saw some doctor, he examined me, he said, yes, you're fit. I loved excitement. I loved something new. I thought, oh, back again over the sea, here and there and everywhere.
So there you have it. He chased excitement, and he wanted to go around the world and to fight a war. Eh?
Good God. He didn't know what he'd let himself into.
22 years old. And it's here, right here, 100 years ago, that his journey started.
The great adventure. As they went away to war, all those eager young men, none could know what lay ahead in a place they had not yet heard of, Gallipoli. Tom Burgess would become one of Gallipoli's first prisoners of war. Billy Corlison would have a premonition of death, a premonition that would come true. Jack Shepherd would survive the war, but not the peace. And Charlie O'Hara and my grandfather Martin would live to be older men. Within just 2 months of signing up, the first volunteers were heading overseas. It was October the 16th, 1914. 10 ships, over 8,000 men, and nearly 4,000 horses left Wellington. Together, they formed the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. As they sailed across the Indian Ocean, the boredom of ship life was offset by the constant fear of German raiders. Eventually, the troop ship stopped in Colombo, Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was known at the time. Robert Montgomery is the grandson of Charlie O'Hara, one of my grandfather's good mates from Gallipoli. 100 years after our two grandfathers were here, we've come to the Gall Face Hotel, where Martin led Charlie and a few other New Zealand troops into a little bit of trouble.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a great, unexpected privilege to be sitting in a bar in the same hotel where these men drank 100 years ago.
Trooper Charlie O'Hara from Papatoetoe had joined the Mounted Rifles just days before my grandfather. Monty has no idea that I have an eyewitness account of what our grandfathers got up to.
Well, I was a bit of a naughty boy. I said, come on, let's have a look at Colombo. I've never been here before, have you? No. I said, let's enjoy ourselves. And a Gary came sweeping into us. We all got in, 4 of us. And as soon as we got in, I said, we want to see all the boozers in this place. We went round to the last pub, and I said, my God, we're broke. We haven't got any more money. I said, we've got to pay this bloke. And it was felt to Charlie O'Hara. So Charlie said, I'll pay him. Charlie ran out of the pub with the driver running after him.
I think my grandfather started off the war drinking and he ended it in the same way as he started. So I think it set the tone for his war anyway.
Charlie and Martin were late back to their ship, but eventually they sailed on from Colombo. The Australians and New Zealanders on board probably thought they were heading to England, but instead they were diverted to Egypt, where they would train for the next 5 months.
They arrived in Egypt. Did our grandfathers get up to any more mischief?
Well, we have here a picture of one of the prostitutes available in Egypt for the troops, but all I can say about that is on my grandfather's war record, there is no evidence that he contracted VD at any part of the war. So whether he took part in that, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say just on the basis of that photo that she would not have been very busy.
All joking aside, the good times were rapidly coming to an end for both of our grandfathers.
Cheers to the grandfathers. Well,
So who's going to pay this time?
well, I've got no money.
Gallipoli, my first time here, and it's cold, bitterly cold. There's no one here in winter, only the dead.
Coming to the place where my grandfather came, and I didn't know what I was actually going to do, whether I was actually going to burst into tears or contain myself and control my emotions of walking on the same soil my grandfather did 100 years ago, and it's amazing. I feel very satisfied to actually make the journey. I've touched the water, I've touched the land, and now where I'm standing, right in behind where we're going to, is where my grandfather got involved in the battle with the Turks. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. Atatürk.
So why did my grandfather end up here in Turkey when he was expecting to be fighting the Germans in France? Essentially, it was because the Turks entered the war on the German side. The Turks controlled the Dardanelles, the main sea route to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. And overlooking that vital strip of water is where I'm meeting New Zealand military historian, Dr. Damien Fenton.
The original idea behind the Gallipoli campaign was Winston Churchill's, and his idea was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war really quickly, and he thought he could do that by sending an Allied naval fleet through to the Dardanelles Straits to sit outside the capital, Constantinople, and basically force the Turks to either surrender or face having their capital city flattened by naval bombardment. The Ottoman Turks know this waterway is important, and it's well defended. It's got forts, it's got coastal batteries, guns. They lay minefields across the strait to stop ships. So you've immediately got a problem. To get a fleet up here, you're going to have to get rid of those minefields. To get rid of the minefields, you're going to have to do something about the coastal guns, because they'll sink your minesweepers unless you do. So first of all, they just try a naval attack. And that ends up in a disastrous attack on the 18th of March when we lost 3 battleships. So at that point, they decided, okay, we can't just do this by sending warships up the strait. How about we send a land force to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula and come across and knock out the coastal guns that way, and then open it up for the fleet. So that's where our guys came into it, and that was the job that we were given to do.
Troops from a number of countries, including Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India, and later France, were involved in the Gallipoli landings. The plan was for the British to land at the bottom of the peninsula and for the Anzacs to attack further north.
25th of April. Tell me about that day.
The Anzacs landed in the wrong place. They should have landed 2 kilometres further south on quite a gentle beach. Instead, they landed at the place we now know as Anzac Cove. They're immediately confronted with, you know, these real steep ravines and cliffs, but they press on and basically follow their nose. The problem is, in doing so, they become disorganised. Units get split up and lost. Officers lose track of their men, men lose track of their officers. Nobody really knows who's doing what. It's complete chaos. Now, while that's happening, a commander called Mustafa Kemal, in charge of the Ottoman 19th Division, force of about 12,000, 13,000 men, he orders his division to head straight for Anzac Cove. So by midday, you've suddenly got this massive force of Turkish reinforcements that runs smack into our guys.
The landing was a disaster, but my grandfather would have had little knowledge of that. He and the other mounted rifles were held back in Egypt. Their time would come. One of those who did land on April the 25th was Tom Burgess. Tom, like my grandfather, had signed up in Pukekohe, but in the infantry. His great niece, Carol Over, has been researching Tom Burgess's story from the rugby field to the battlefield.
Tom's battalion was one of the first battalions behind the Australians that landed at Anzac Cove. They were faced with this enormous task of getting up these cliffs in order to fight the Turks, and the Turks were sitting up there and just picking them off.
Tom and the Anzacs made some progress that first day, but then were forced to pull back.
Tom he was wounded, and when his battalion retreated, Tom was left. He lay in the battlefield for 3 days. It's reported that every Turk that went past him either bayonetted him or battened him. Yeah, he was eventually picked up by the Turkish stretcher bearers and taken to a base hospital on the peninsula, and then he probably would have been taken by ship into Constantinople, or Istanbul as it is today, where he was put in the Giuliani hospital.
Word of Thomas's capture eventually merged when his name appeared in the New Zealand Herald. He also managed to get letters home to friends and family that were printed in the local newspapers.
Goodness gracious me, look at this here. September the 9th, 1915. There he is, look, Private Thomas Hayes Burgess. His name appeared on the casualty list published in July the 12th.
Just a few lines to let you know that I'm alive and well. Well, I've had a pretty rough time. I was wounded and taken prisoner by the Turks when our troops landed at Dardanelles. I was treated very kindly by them, have been in a splendid hospital for 2 months, where my wounds have healed up quite well.
Wow, man, that's quite special, isn't it?
That is very special.
But that letter belied what was really going on.
On August 26th, he was transferred to another hospital called Tashkishla, which was what they called a punishment hospital. The Turks thought that the Turkish prisoners of war were being badly treated by the British, so then they decided that there was going to be retaliation. The conditions in Tashkishla were appalling. The guys slept on mattresses on the floor. If they were lucky enough to get one, they usually had 3 apiece to a mattress. Thomas was doing okay, and then he died.
His death must have been unexpected news to family back home.
Why did he die when he appeared to be doing so well?
Much later, the truth came out. Another New Zealand prisoner of war, Private William Surgener, filed a startling report, but it took almost 100 years before Carol would see it.
Private Burgess was left behind when his crowd retired at Gallipoli, having been wounded. Some stretcher bearers picked him up and he was taken to camp. He told me himself that he had been sodomized there. Bloody hell. He was then taken to hospital suffering from pneumonia, appendicitis and exhaustion.
Oh, well, it was very, very distressing, you know, to find that out, but at least you know what happened to him, what he went through.
The little rugby guy from Pukekohe.
I don't know, I've always had this connection with Tom, and I have no idea why. So I really wanted to go and visit his grave, and that's the headstone.
Whew.
I was the first person from our family that's ever visited Tom's grave. After the emotion passed, then I got really, really angry, and I just, you know, what the bloody hell is he doing here? I mean, he's 10,500 miles away from home. He should be back in our country where we can go and see him, and all these sort of things, you know. And but what has been really nice about it, when I, you know, told all my cousins and so forth that I'd been, that now a lot of them also want to go, and I think it was worthwhile.
Okay. I got a lump in my throat. Terrible as Tom Burgess's death was, it wouldn't be the last. More Anzacs were required to fill the gap, and one of them was my grandfather. Two weeks after the landing at Gallipoli, reinforcements were urgently needed. The mounted rifles, the horses still in Egypt, were called to relieve those left from the first landing on April the 25th.
We saw that we were getting closer because there were young men coming out from the trenches that only looked to be about 15 and 16 years old. The sigh of relief as they came out, they were all of a shake, and I thought, oh, isn't it a devil of a thing putting little boys right at the very pinnacle of that blasted hill.
My grandfather and the rest of the Auckland Mounted Rifles would spend most of their time at Gallipoli at a place called Walker's Ridge.
The ridge itself, there's actually on the other side there's sort of a slope, and in the mountains we're told that's where you're going to be living, that's where your bivvies and your dugouts are. So that's where they sort of sleep and eat. And then up here, more or less where we are, this is the front line. The formidable sheer cliffs, I mean, you can just see the scale of it. It must have been, I mean, they must have just arrived here and just thought, where have we landed? You know, what are we supposed to do with this?
The landscape has changed down the years. There's more vegetation now, and they say perhaps as much as 10 metres of topsoil has eroded away. Even so, I find it hard to believe anyone could have lived here.
Well, here we are. We're actually on Walker's Ridge, 100 years on. My grandfather was walking this too, with a lot of his mates, friends, Australian guys, Kiwi guys. And just behind us, the front line.
Okay, so this is a network of...
Further inland, a few trenches remain. Here, everyday life was exceptionally tough for men like my grandfather.
The heat really became a problem for the men, mainly because of the lack of water. There just isn't enough water in that area that they hold on Anzac to supply 20,000 men. Consequently, it becomes pretty filthy, you know, fairly quickly. Lice becomes a problem. Lice gets into their uniforms and their bedding and their bivouacs. And then, of course, you also get the flies. And with the flies comes disease and sickness. And sure enough, there's an outbreak of dysentery, and just about every man comes down with it at some point. It's pretty harsh conditions.
And on May the 19th, the atmosphere changed. Turkish troops began a whole new kind of attack.
And then we heard Allah, 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 Allah being called. And somebody said, oh my God, it's the bloody Turks. They're attacking. There were the officers running up and down on the fire step, yet right to the top. Start shooting. The enemy's there.
Keep going then!
These Turks, they got right close up to Walker's Ridge.
There were about 60,000 Turkish and Arab soldiers involved in this attack, 40,000 in the first wave alone.
40,000?
40,000, spread around the perimeter, but even so, your grandfather would have no doubt been facing, looking at, I don't know, tens, hundreds of Turkish or Arab soldiers coming at him. They were going to absolutely annihilate the Anzacs and the enclave and just wipe it out. And it was an attack all along the line, so the whole Anzac perimeter, and there was nothing subtle about it. It was just a full frontal assault, just charging directly at our trenches, straight at us. And I mean, it must have been terrifying. Your grandfather and his mates in the Auckland Mounted, they stood their ground. They stayed in their trenches. They manned the fire step. The machine gunners, did their terrible work, and they stopped the Turkish attack literally dead. The Ottoman Turks lost 10,000 men out of that 40,000 in the space of a couple of hours, and at least 3,000 dead. I mean, it was slaughter. It was just slaughter. No man's land, but the area between the two front lines is now carpeted with dead bodies. And so both sides agree to have an armistice for one day, to go out there and retrieve bodies and clear them.
Burying the dead during the brief armistice must have been hard. The respite gave everyone time to reflect. Billy Collison, my grandfather's friend, so brave during the fighting, developed a bad feeling.
Now, Billy Collison, he was in our section, and Billy we all liked him. He was only about 19. He had a premonition that he was going to get killed. We all said, come on, Billy.
Billy, yeah. Chunuk, just bloody dream.
I don't know, he said, I don't know. But I've got a feeling, what a feeling. Something's going to happen. And as sure as we were ordered in this trench this night, there must have been a Turk that had seen this head come up and have a look. Somebody said, Billy, stop putting your head over the top looking there. They will shoot you. There was a bang. Oh, God, they shot him. He knew he was going to get shot. He knew his life had come to an end.
Billy Collison's death would haunt my grandfather for the rest of his life. The Gallipoli campaign had been going for nearly 7 weeks, and the pressures and the casualties were increasing. By mid-June, my grandfather had been on Walker's Ridge for a month. He was tired. People had been dying all around him. 4 days after Billy's death, my grandfather was approached by an NCO and ordered back up to the front line.
Sergeant Ross had come up to me and said, I've got to get another 2 or 3 men together. They've got to go out to another 3 outposts. I said, I was out at the outposts for 2 days this week, and I said, I've only just been out of the trenches. And he said, I've been given orders to get them, and you're one of the men I'm going to get. I said, no, you're not. And I started fighting him on the side of the hill. And I was about to go back to the boys, and this blasted shell exploded right in my face. Went through my shoulder, went through my legs down here, through this knee, and somebody said, my God, Brookie, I wonder it didn't kill you. Oh, I said, I'll never get killed. I said, I've been preserved for better things.
This is the first time I've heard that story. It's a shock, but even more disconcerting to me is Damien's take on the events that had led up to the explosion.
On one level, he's obviously very unlucky that he just happens to be where this random shell has landed and exploded. He's copped it. On the other hand, It hasn't killed him, at least not outright, and you could argue that this has possibly saved him from a court-martial.
Hey?
But disobeying an order in the face of the enemy carries the death penalty.
Really?
Yeah, really. Yep.
So can I sort of loosely say that it's probably a good thing that my grandfather got hit?
May well have. I mean, it's not to say that he wouldn't necessarily have been sentenced to death, and he probably wouldn't have been, but technically it is there as a possibility.
My grandfather ended up on the beach, waiting for life-saving medical treatment. But like so many injured Anzacs due to be treated on hospital ships, his survival was mostly a matter of luck.
He comes down here for 2 days, waiting to get rescued.
Early in the campaign, the Anzacs had just one dedicated hospital ship at Gallipoli, the Gascon. Susanna de Vries is an historian and author. She's researched the terrible conditions medical staff worked in.
There's 3 doctors, 7 nurses looking after. At one stage, they have as many as 900 people on the Gascon, you know, crowded together like sardines. They didn't have penicillin, they didn't have modern painkillers, and they didn't have blood transfusions. All they have is morphine, and when the morphine runs out, there are, terrible, terrible pain is endured by these poor men. Thousands of men died who didn't need to die. Your grandfather is taken on board on the 16th of June. In the heat of the summer, he's taken on board, he's blue-carded to have an operation. He's very lucky that he doesn't get gangrene, or they would have had to amputate an arm and a leg. The gangrene is the great killer of the Anzacs. More people die of gangrene than die of being shot on the beach.
My grandfather survived the surgery, but many of those around him were not so lucky.
There were the different forms lying on the deck. They were all in canvas, and you could see one leg here, one arm or no arms, or 2 legs off, just the body, all being buried. And as they buried them, they all went down into all with a big heavy stone in to take them to the bottom.
I think the description of the funeral is what's so very interesting in your grandfather's account, because at the time of Gallipoli, he couldn't have mentioned this. Funerals are a banned topic.
2 of the nurses on the Gascon tried unsuccessfully to get the word out about conditions on the hospital ship. It's taken 100 years for the nurses' diaries to fully come to light.
It's the lost story of the war, because they saved 10,000 Anzacs. They were truly heroic, and your grandfather's story is very interesting because it's almost the missing piece in the jigsaw.
Trooper Brook.
Trooper Brook.
My grandfather was evacuated and arrived in Egypt on June the 30th, 1915. But for the New Zealand troops he left behind, Gallipoli was far from over. This monument memorialises a battle called Chunuk Bair. Around August 8th, New Zealand troops pushed higher than any of the Allied troops had ever been before.
In honour of the soldiers of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, 8th of August, 1915, from the uppermost ends of the earth. Ataturk.
Briefly, the Kiwi soldiers glimpsed their objective, the Dardanelles, for the first and only time before being pushed back. The New Zealand loss of life at Chunuk Bair was horrendous, and when the RSA was established the next year, some even argued that August the 8th was a more fitting date for Anzac Day rather than the 25th of April. The standoff at Gallipoli continued through the heat of the Turkish summer. The New Zealanders made one more offensive push to try and break the enemy lines. 93-year-old Margaret Shepherd's father, Jack Shepherd, was one of those who survived long enough to take part in the Battle of Chunuk Bair. Margaret and her son, John Keenan, treasure Jack's wartime diary, which records events at Gallipoli after my grandfather had been evacuated. Events that almost obliterated the regiment they both shared, the Auckland Mounted Rifles. John, we're on August the 7th. It's quite a critical day. It's a crucial day, isn't it?
It is.
What happened there?
Well, it's a crucial day for New Zealand's nationhood and its military history, because that was the start of the Battle of Chunuk Bair.
We charged across about 100 yards of open ground, swept by machine guns, and a good many of our chaps fell, shot in the rush. After crossing the hilltop, we came to a small hollow where we lay in the scrub, at the mercy of the snipers and shrapnel.
Chunuk Bair is a terrible, terrible loss of life. The Auckland Mounted Rifles were all but wiped out.
Jack was wounded at Chunuk Bair. He was shipped to England to recover. While there, pictures of home in front of him, he wrote to family in New Zealand explaining what had happened.
My word, it was an awful day, that 8th of August. I will never forget it. The whole of our regiment was nearly wiped out.
While Jack recovered, those Allied troops still on the peninsula were withdrawn. The 8-month campaign had been a disaster. Gallipoli became the defeat we can never forget. Elsewhere, the war continued, and Jack Shepherd, again deemed fit to fight, was sent to the Western Front to Belgium. He arrived in time for the Battle of Passchendaele, which saw 3,700 New Zealand casualties, including 845 deaths in one day. Jack Shepherd served nearly 4 years, almost constantly in the front line.
It's all such a hopeless business, isn't it? A terrible sacrifice, and young men in the best days of their growing up to be have to live like this and have all so many of his friends drop beside him, and then to keep on going. And eventually he came back to New Zealand, but he never recovered from the ordeal. He was obviously stressed, and evidently he went to some doctor that was way up north and told to go and get over it. So unfortunately, my father took his own life in the end.
Margaret was just 4 years old when her father committed suicide.
Well, I feel very sad that a man who had a life to live was broken by war and lack of help.
But there was nothing.
There was nothing there.
So that's from Martin, and that's from Jack.
Good on you. Excellent.
My father. Yeah.
The Raweni Ferry in the far north. A sentimental journey. For just over 60 years, the location of Jack Shepherd's grave was unknown. But after a lot of painstaking research, Margaret identified her father's final resting place at a settlement called Kohukohu in Hokianga. Jack Shepherd lies here in an unmarked plot. Margaret is determined to give her father a headstone.
It's lovely to have you around like this and understanding. Really is nice.
Jack's at peace, huh?
Yes.
The journey to follow my grandfather's Gallipoli story has left me with one last piece of unfinished business. A meeting with a man called Grant Corlison. We meet at the Auckland War Memorial Museum at the Hall of Memory.
My dad brought me here when I was about 8 or 9 and pointed out his younger brother up there, William Corlison, and I think he was known to your granddad as Billy.
Grant knows a few things about his uncle, but not how he died.
Now, do you know my grandfather was an eyewitness to Billy's last moments?
No.
So I'm going to play you something, and you'll be very interested to hear this.
Now, Billy Collison, he was in our section. We all liked him. He was only about 19. He had a premonition that he was going to get killed. And as sure as we were ordered in this trench this night, there was a bang. Somebody said, "Oh, God, they shot him." He knew he was going to get shot. He knew his life had come to an end.
It's lovely that your granddad was there with him when it happened.
Only a few yards away from each other.
And I think there's one last memory my grandfather would want me to share.
As a Gallipoli veteran in particular, and as a World War I veteran, what does Anzac Day mean to you?
I particularly think of Billy Collison. I often think of little Billy Collison, and I've often thought if I only knew where some of his people were, I'd go and see them and talk about Billy. But it's too long ago. It's 80 years ago.
Well, what a lovely piece to be able to hear that all these years later. Remarkable.
I want to stand up and give you what my grandfather wanted to do, so thank you very much.
Hey.
Yeah.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome, man.
Yeah, you too.
Fantastic.
The British artist Banksy said something interesting. We die twice, he said. The first time when we stop breathing. The final time when our name is spoken for the last time. Learning more about Gallipoli and my grandfather and his mates, I've learned some names I never knew before. Billy Corlison, Tom Burgess, Charlie O'Hara, and Jack Shepherd. Names my family will be talking about for a very long time to come. My grandfather survived World War I. He came home and married Sybil Zinzad, who was the love of his life. He got a soldier's rehab farm, raised a family, saw 2 of his grandsons become All Blacks, and lived till 102. In many ways, Martin Brooke was the quintessential New Zealander. At the beginning of the war, he thought of himself as British, but when he came home, he was a Kiwi. That, they say, is the legacy of Gallipoli.